All right, guys. Tonight we're going to look at the second part of our chapter on learning. Last week we looked at classical conditioning. This week we're going to look at another form of learning called operant conditioning. And if you remember from last week, classical conditioning is a type of learning through association. In operant conditioning, the learning is through consequence. So let's start looking at operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is a form of learning in which a response comes to be controlled by its consequences. The picture that you're looking at here is of Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner, and he was one of the first to describe this type of learning in the late 1930s. Skinner was able to demonstrate that organisms tend to repeat those responses that are followed by favorable consequences. This fundamental principle is embodied in Skinner's concept of reinforcement. Reinforcement occurs when an event following a response increases an organism's tendency to make that response. In other words, a response is strengthened because it leads to rewarding consequences. So Skinner and his followers have shown that much of our everyday behavior is regulated by reinforcement. For example, you study hard because you get good grades, and then you're likely to study again. So the result of getting good grades that follows studying increases the likelihood to have you study next time. If you studied and studied and studied and kept failing, odds are eventually you would stop studying. But since studying is followed by a good consequence, a good grade, it tends to increase the likelihood of the behavior happening again. Here's another example. You tell jokes and your friends laugh with you, so you tell more jokes. The principle of reinforcement clearly governs complex aspects of human behavior. Paradoxically, this principle emerged out of Skinner's research on the behavior of rats and pigeons in exceptionally simple situations. So what I want to do now is take a look at some of that research that Skinner did. Excuse me. Like Pavlov, Skinner created a prototype experimental procedure that had been repeated with variations thousands of times. In this procedure, an animal, typically a rat or a pigeon, is placed in an operant chamber that has come to be known as a Skinner box. A Skinner box is a small enclosure in which an animal can make specific responses that is systematically recorded while the consequences of the response are controlled. In boxes designated for rats, the main response made available is pressing a small lever mounted on one sidewall. Typically, the experimenter manipulates whether positive consequences occur when the animal makes the designated response. The main positive consequence is usually the delivery of a small bit of food into a cup mounted in the chamber. A speaker and a signal light permit manipulation of visual and auditory stimuli. An electric grid allows the experimenter to deliver aversive consequences in the form of an electric shock. I'll show you a video of a rat in a Skinner box.
Here we see a Skinner box designed for rats. As you can see, this operant chamber has two levers that the rat can press, as well as two sets of signal lights for discrimination training. The reinforcement contingencies in the chamber are controlled by this electronic apparatus. Reinforcement in this box involves giving the rat a little water in the tiny water cup mounted on the right wall. When a rat is first placed in a Skinner box, it tends to explore its new environment. Some rats may explore for a long time and show no inclination to press a lever. When this is the case, the experimenter may have to shape the lever pressing response. However, most rats spontaneously engage in lever pressing and eventually learn that this response is followed by reinforcement. As a result, their lever pressing response is strengthened and the rate of response gradually increases. When a strong, steady rate of response is established, as in this rat, the experimenter can manipulate various aspects of the reinforcement contingencies to study the principles that govern operant conditioning.
Okay. So the key dependent variable in most research in operant conditioning is the subject's response rate over time. A rat's rate of lever pressing in the Skinner box is monitored continuously by a device known as a cumulative recorder. This device creates a graphic record of responding and reinforcement in a Skinner box as a function of time. The recorder works by the means of a roll of paper that moves at a steady rate underneath a movable pen. When the subject is not responding, the pen stays still and draws a slight horizontal line, reflecting the passage of time. Whenever the designated response occurs, the pen moves upward a notch, creating a step in the line. The pen's movement produces a graphic summary of the animal's responses over time. A series of rapid responses creates a series of short steps. The pen also makes a slash mark to record the delivery of each reinforcer. The results of operant conditioning studies are usually portrayed in graphs like the one shown here. In these graphs, the horizontal axis is used to mark the passage of time, while the vertical axis is used to plot the accumulation of responses. In interpreting these graphs, the key consideration is the slope of the line that represents the record of responding. To explore the relationship between the slope of the line and the response rate, I'm going to click on each of the boxed areas. So here, an increased response rate produces a progressively steeper slope. Here, a steady response rate produces a steep, stable slope. And here, a decreasing response rate produces a progressively flatter slope. Because the response record is cumulative, the line never goes down. It either goes up as more responses accumulate or flattens if the response rate slows to zero. So let's check your understanding of what we just talked about. Assume that the graph below were generated by a cumulative recorder. Click on the graph that shows the shape of a response line generated by a decreasing rate of response. So a decreasing rate of response, because the line is getting flatter, would look like that. A rapid, steady rate of response, and then an increasing rate of response. In operant conditioning, as in classical conditioning, acquisition refers to the initial stage of learning some pattern of responding. Operant conditioning is usually established through a gradual process called shaping, which involves the reinforcement of closer and closer approximations of a desired response. Shaping is necessary when an organism does not on its own emit the desired response. For example, when a rat is first placed in a Skinner box, it may not press the lever at all. In this case, the experimenter begins shaping lever pressing behavior by reinforcing the rat whenever it moves towards the lever. As the rat's movement toward the lever becomes more frequent, the experimenter starts requiring a closer approximation of the desired response, possibly reinforcing the rat only when it actually touches the lever. As reinforcement increases the rat's tendency to touch the lever, the rat will spontaneously press the lever on occasion, finally providing the opportunity for the experimenter to reinforce the designated response. These reinforcements will gradually increase as the rate of lever pressing increases. So I'll show you an example of that too.
I'm going to use this switch to operate the magazine, to reinforce the pigeon for doing something, and you will, I trust, see this effect on the pigeon. And we're going to try another pigeon now, and I will try to pick out some particular pattern of behavior and make it a more frequent part of the repertoire of the bird. Suppose I shape up the behavior of making a complete turn. What I do is simply, as I did then, to
to wait for some part of that behavior. There's more of it, you see. You see the effect is instantaneous. I'm waiting for it to turn counterclockwise now. And then I reinforce that movement. And I wait for a more pronounced movement than that. It's got to be more than that. There we go, all the way around.
Okay. The mechanisms of shaping is the key to training animals to perform impressive tricks. When you go to a zoo, a circus, or a marine park and you see animals performing, you are witnessing the results of shaping. Keller and Marianne Breland, two psychologists influenced by Skinner, went into the business of shaping animals for advertising and entertainment purposes. One of their better-known feats was shaping Priscilla, the fastidious pig, to turn on a radio, eat at a table, put dirty clothes in a hamper, run a vacuum cleaner, and then go shopping with a shopping cart, all based on operant conditioning. See if I can show you a video of that too. There's Priscilla. Okay. So another concept that we have to talk about is extinction. In operant conditioning, extinction refers to the gradual weakening and disappearance of a response tendency because the response is no longer followed by a reinforcer. Extinction begins whenever previously available reinforcement is stopped. In laboratory studies with rats, this usually means that the experimenter stops delivering the food when the rat presses the lever. When extinction process is begun, there is often a brief surge in the rat's recording, followed by a gradual decline in response rate until it approaches zero. The same effects are generally seen in the extinction of human behavior. A key issue in operant conditioning is how much resistance to extinction an organism will display when reinforcement is halted. That is, how long will an organism continue to make a response after delivery of the reinforcer has been terminated. The greater the resistance to extinction, the longer the responding will continue after the termination of reinforcement. In the graph shown here, the response shows low resistance to extinction. It tapers off very quickly after the researcher stops giving reinforcement for lever pressing. So if you click on it, I'll increase the resistance to extinction. That's what it looks like. Okay? So then we could lower it and raise it. Okay, that's the end of video 1.